Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. On October 26, 1985, Marty McFly hopped into the DeLorean for the first time and got that baby up to 88 miles per hour. Or at least that's what happened in the Back to the Future film, which was released in the US on July 3rd of 1985. This was smack dab in the middle of the decade, and probably around the start of training camp for one of the greatest teams in NFL history, the 85 Bears. This week's guest talks about that team and more in his recent book release. And it all revolves the NFL in the 80s.
Welcome to the Football History Dude podcast, where each episode is a journey back in time to learn about the rich history of the NFL. Your host is Arnie Chapman. Football is his passion, and he wants you to come along with him to explore the yesteryear of the gridiron. So hop on board his DeLorean, and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
This time, as we step off the DeLorean, the date is July 3rd, 1985, and we are in Anywhere, USA. We're at the movie theaters. And this time, it means a little bit more when we step off the DeLorean, because your host, this happens to be one of his favorite movies of all time, and we're here to watch Back to the Future. Yeah, we have that on the cover of this show, and it's fitting because this week's guest wrote about a book around the NFL in the 1980s, a decade that he felt was better than he could have even imagined before he started digging into it. Kind of like the movies of the 80s. Many of them were a wild ride, molding the industry for years to come. Similar to the same thing that happened in the NFL during this time. We have the strikes and many other events that happened during the 1980s. But we really focus big on those 1980s strikes, don't we? But there was a lot of innovation that went on too, just like in the movie industry. And this week's guest is Tommy Phillips. And here's a little bit of a background of Tommy. Tommy A. Phillips is an avid Packers fan from Pittsburgh. He has been to NFL games in 6 cities and hopes to visit many more in the near future. His first work was Nifty 90s, the stories of an amazing decade in pro football history, focused on the NFL in the 90s. His most recent work is Great 80s, a journey through another exciting decade in pro football history, focusing, of course, on the NFL in the 1980s. And as always, I'll leave links to these books and also his website in the show notes, which you can get to through your podcast player or by heading to thefootballhistorydude.com, which now, of course, takes you over to my page on the Sports History Network, the headquarters for your favorite sports yesteryear. This is a network at the very early stages, so if you know of a podcast or other show that you think should be on the network, or you're even looking to start your own history podcast about your favorite sport, team, or league, or maybe make the Sports History Network your home field advantage for your own personal blog, hit us up over on the website at the contact page. But for now, let's dig into the 1980s in the NFL with Tommy Phillips. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was looking through, I see that you have multiple books, and one of them was 49ers versus Packers. How did you even become a Packers fan to begin with?
It's a long story, but basically, I was reading old books, and when I was like about 10 years old, and there was these old football books, and I was reading them, and back then the Packers had been really bad for a couple decades, so I kind of felt bad for them, and so I eventually chose them as my favorite team. And it happened. I started cheering for them right around the time they became really good. So most people would think, oh, I became a fan in 1995, right whenever they became really good. But it was because I felt bad for them, and that was the reason I did.
Right, yeah, then not too long after that was the the Super Bowl win and everything, so it kinda worked out for you.
Yeah.
Me as a Detroit Lions fan, it's almost sacrilege for me to talk to you with that cup in the back. I see that Green Bay Packers cup and some other trucks and things like that. But, so you said you started watching them more in, like, the '90s, and I know that one of your books, of course, the 49ers versus the Packers, the other one was the decade covering the nifty '90s, you called them. But then more recently, you released a book called The Great '80s. What was the reason for those 2 decades, and what was the reason why you wanted to write about such a broad topic like that?
um, the original '90s book came upon me. It's really weird, but it came in a dream. Like I had a dream about how good football was back in the '90s, and I woke up and I typed into my iPhone. I was like, okay, I just had this dream about the '90s, and I should write a book about it. And it was just like an innocent dream, but then all of a sudden it turned into a big project, and I put all kinds of work into it. I was like, okay, I'm gonna buy all those greatest games DVD sets they have out on a NFL shop, and I started putting through. Um, I started working on just like a bare bones type of review of the '90s, and then I started watching games, and I was like, okay, I'm going to review the whole games, and then eventually I got into doing the whole decade with every single playoff game and the 100 most uh, memorable games, and I put all that into a book. It took me 2 years to write it, but it all started from a dream. So yeah, crazy story.
That's kinda cool. Yeah, you have a dream, and then that's like almost like an epiphany. "Hey, I
Yeah,
gotta write this book because it came to me."
yeah.
I mean, you said that it took you almost 2 years. What is that process like for somebody? Were you an author previously, or was that the first time you wrote a book?
Oh, that this is the first time I wrote a book. I mean, I had done blogging for about 10 years, but never anything really big. And I began writing it just as okay. I'm just going to tell this little story about the '90s. It's going to be really short. Wow, it became almost 300,000 words worth, and I found myself unable to stop after a while, and then eventually I got that big. Yeah, I wasn't an author before this. This is my first journey into it. So there are some things that whenever I did, I think I might have done differently now, but for the most part, I'm pretty happy with what I wrote.
Yeah, and you mentioned you were a blog writer for, 10 odd years, and one of the questions I do ask most of the guests of the show that are authors, if you could have went back to your whenever you started writing this book, right after the dream, what advice would you have given yourself now knowing what you know for writing the book?
I probably would have told myself to not focus on every single little thing, but focus on the big plays because I would get so bogged down in the little plays when it like the 3 yard gains and 2 yard rushes and stuff, and I would get so caught up in that when I first started writing that whenever I had to go back and edit it, um, I had to make sure that I told more about the biggest plays. Whenever I was first writing, I was thinking, okay, I'm just going to write every single play that happens. And um, over time, I realized that wasn't feasible, and I had to change my way of doing it after that.
That's not the first time I've heard this on this podcast. I've heard a couple different authors have said, "Yeah, I wrote the book and it was 900 pages long." And then my wife told me, "What are you doing? No one wants to read about every single play in the
Yeah,
game." So that seems like a common theme for when people are getting into writing books like that, especially on football, because it's such a like you covered a decade, the 90s. That's just there's so much there. I mean, like
yeah.
how, can't even fathom how you would have categorize that in your mind to put them together. And then more recently, the 80s decade you covered, that just came out recently, didn't it?
Yeah, that came out in April. I was going to release it. It happened to be on my sister's birthday, but then I waited a day. I waited a day so that I wouldn't steal her thunder. But yeah, that one also took 2 years to write. Um, Although I probably could have finished it sooner. The couple of the other books I wrote, I ended up, I wrote, I wrote maybe about a quarter of the 80s book, and then I got sidetracked into writing those books. So it probably could have been, I could have done it shorter, but the book ended up almost 500,000 words. That's how many I put into it. Yeah, it was just, ended up really long.
Yeah, I mean, again, going over one particular decade for that's even a 500,000 words obviously won't cover all the details and minutia at the low level. How did you determine the chapters of the book as far as the 80s one goes?
Well, the 90s book pretty much gave me a, um, good outline to follow. And basically, I decided I was going to do the 100 most memorable regular season games, which turned into 120 because I couldn't narrow it down enough. And then I did every playoff game, and then I did reviews of each year, and then at the end, I did the top 10 quarterbacks, top 10 head coaches, MVPs, etc. And that's how I went about doing it.
So a big time, I guess you could say, informational, where if someone were to want to read it chunk by chunk, it wouldn't take away from reading the whole book at a time.
Right. It's written in such a way that you can read it for like 5 minutes and then put it down and pick up again. That's the way I envisioned it. Like one person I know who bought it said it was a great bathroom book. So so because he would be able to read little chunks of it while he was in the bathroom and then pick it up later and not really miss anything. So that's kind of the way it's written.
For me, it'd be in the sauna. I like to read my hard copy books in the sauna because I don't want to take my phone in there, and I think that would be a perfect book for it. So I don't get myself too dehydrated. I guess let's talk about some of those various chapters or topics. A big thing that comes from the 80s. A lot of times, outside looking in, we think about the strikes. I mean,
Mhm.
let's talk a little bit about the strikes of the 80s.
Yeah, 1982 strike. Teams played 2 weeks, and then players went on strike and ended up missing 7 weeks of the season. I think it went on for 8 weeks, but then they added on one of the weeks that they missed and tacked it on the end of the season. And as a result, attendance went down, and the players really didn't get what they wanted out of it, not right away. But one of the most unique things about that strike is that the Packers Bears rivalry, uh, teams didn't even play each other that year thanks to both of their games getting canceled, which means that the most so technically the longest running rivalry in the NFL is the Packers and the Lions, as the Packers and Bears didn't play that year. So that was one of the more interesting things that come out of it. Of course, Washington, the Redskins ended up only losing one game that year in the regular season, and they went on to win the Super Bowl. So they were the first team since Miami to make it all the way with losing one game or less.
Speaking of the Redskins and having such a good year that year, who were some of the better coaches and how did they help progress the game during the 80s?
Yeah, well, obviously Joe Gibbs was one of the best coaches because he could win with any quarterback he got, and he was able to win with Joe Theismann. Um, and then in the late '80s, it was like musical chairs of quarterbacks. They were just going through them left and right. Jay Schrader, Doug Williams, Mark Rippon. They were just it didn't matter who was going to be the quarterback. Joe Gibbs found a way to win with them. Of course, the most innovative coach was Bill Walsh. He came up with the West Coast offense system, which changed things where, in the 70s, the idea was throw the ball really long and hope someone came down with it. And Bill Walsh changed that into a thing where it would be a high percentage passing, and he found the perfect quarterback for that in Joe Montana. And he changed the offense into that quick strike thing where they throw the short passes, and you'd see it such as in one game in 1989 where Joe Montana threw a couple short passes to John Taylor. They both ended up as 90 plus touchdown receptions. So you think a 90 plus touchdown reception and the ball to go far in the air, but neither of those passes were thrown very far. So yeah, he was definitely the most innovative. And then Tom Flores able to win with Jim Plunkett as he won 2 Super Bowls with Jim Plunkett as quarterback. And Jim Plunkett isn't exactly a Hall of Famer. He's a great quarterback, but not that great. And Flores was able to win with him. And of course, Bill Parcells and Mike Ditka, both of them had really good teams in the second half of the 80s, and Parcells eventually won another one in 1990.
You said that you were able to watch a lot of the old films from the 80s then?
Yeah, I was.
What were some of the games or plays or things like that that kind of stuck in your mind that you're like, whoa, that was awesome?
Yeah, the game I ranked as the number one game of the 80s was the shootout between Dan Marino and Ken O'Brien in 1986. That was just an unbelievable game. I think the final score was like 51-45, and the Jets won it in overtime. Both teams threw for insane number of touchdowns and passes. I can't count exactly how many there were. Another great one was the Packers and the Redskins in 1983, whenever they played Monday Night Football, and the game ended on a missed field goal by Mark Mosley, and the Packers won 48-47. Yeah, and one of the games no one ever talks about, but I thought was a really good game, was one between the Rams and the Vikings in 1989. The Vikings kicked 7 field goals in the game, which was tied for the league record, but the Rams somehow came back in the final 2 minutes of the game to score 2 touchdowns, and then the Vikings threw up a Hail Mary to set up the 7th field goal. And then it went into overtime, and it ends on a block kick for a safety. And so the Vikings won the game by 2 points. They won 23-21, and not a single one of those 23 points did they score on offense or defense. It was all special teams. So
that's crazy to think about that.
Yeah, that was one of the most unique games of the decade.
And I'm wondering also, you bring up a good point about it ended on a safety in overtime. I wonder how many times that's ever happened in NFL history.
Yeah, it's only happened a handful of times. I think that was the first time, actually. I cannot remember another one. I know there was a game-winning safety earlier on in the 80s where there was a Dallas-New Orleans game where one team was up by 1, and then the other team got a safety and won the game by 1 point. But I think that was the first overtime safety in league history. I'm not sure though.
Yeah, I wouldn't know either. I'd have to go back to check it out, but that's pretty interesting I mean, talk about heart-wrenching to
Yeah.
be in the stands if you see that happening.
Yeah.
You mentioned some of the great quarterbacks already, Joe Montana, Dan Marino. Like, talk about some of the other great quarterbacks of the 80s.
Well, John Elway, he was able to win with very little help. A lot of people say Dan Marino, didn't have a very good, and it was true. Dan Marino didn't have any running game to work with. John Elway really didn't even have any uh, really good receivers to work with. He just found a way to win with whoever was in there, and uh, anytime the team was in a situation where they're trailing late in the fourth quarter, you knew that he was going to bring them back. Of course, Joe Theismann, early in the '80s, was one of the best quarterbacks. That was before Montana had really come on. Theismann was pretty much the best quarterback in the NFC for those first few years. And Dan Fouts doesn't get enough credit with the Chargers because his team never made it to the Super Bowl. But his numbers that he put up during the '80s were just insane. I mean, they were those numbers don't look as good now, but he was in the high 4,000s of yards, a few seasons. And he probably sort of won the MVP in 1982, this strike shortened season, where they gave it to a kicker, Mark Mosley. And I thought Dan Fouts deserved it more.
That was the only time in NFL history, I think, that a kicker won the MVP,
Yeah,
too.
it was. Yeah.
The lonely kicker only gets it in a shortened season.
Yeah.
You mentioned like maybe half of the quarterbacks that you talked about were from AFC and the others from the NFC.
Mhm.
What was the power struggle between the AFC and NFC during the 80s?
Yeah, I think the big difference between the NFC and the AFC is that the NFC had all the best defenses. Of course, Chicago had one of the best defenses ever. The New York Giants had another really great defense, and the 49ers and Redskins also put together some amazing defense. Just think of the players: Lawrence Taylor, Mike Singletary, Ronnie Lott, even Dexter Manley. The AFC didn't really have as good defense, and um, the coaching was also a lot better in NFC. Certainly, I was just going through the coaches, and I'm like, most of these coaches come from the NFC, and the AFC really didn't have as much. Don Shula and Dan Reeves were pretty good, but no one was as consistent as in the NFC.
So I guess we like to say, what if? Like, what if the coaches would have been the AFC or yada yada? What would you say is the biggest what if that could have changed how we look at football now from the 80s?
Well, I think it goes back to one play that no one ever talks about. Although I did recently see a book where they actually brought this up. But in Super Bowl 17, the Dolphins were beating the Redskins by 4 points, and Joe Theismann was back near his own end zone. He threw a pass, and it got batted in the air, and it was about to be intercepted at the 2-yard line, and they would have gone in for a touchdown. Theismann bats down his own pass. The Redskins go on and win. And you wonder if the Dolphins catch that, they go up by 11 points, probably win that game. Maybe they don't draft Dan Marino because they think that they were good enough the way they were. So then maybe Dan Marino doesn't end up in Miami. Maybe he ends up somewhere else. There's so many possibilities. Maybe the Redskins don't turn out to be the dynasty they were. There were just so many things that could have happened, and it was all because of one play where Joe Theismann thought well enough to knock down his own pass, and stopped the Dolphins from getting a pick six.
Yeah, it's funny how moments in games can ultimately change, like you said, maybe even the course of an entire franchise or multiple franchises because of if Marino would have been picked or not. We've talked about a lot of great coaches, great players, and things. What would you say if I asked you the question, who would be your Mount Rushmore of the 80s?
Okay, it has to have Joe Montana and Bill Walsh on it because obviously the 49ers won, 4 Super Bowls and were such a dominant team. I would put a defensive player on there. I'd have to put on Lawrence Taylor of the Giants. He won MVP of the whole league in 1986. And then if I had to pick a fourth person, it would probably have to be John Elway, simply because he was one of the most fun people to watch during the decade. Broncos didn't win any Super Bowls, but they did get the 3 of them. And he was the only reason why they made it to those 3 Super Bowls. Without him, there's no way they would have come even close. So, yeah, I'd have to put Elway on there.
So it's almost like he overcame
Yeah.
more than the other players had to, kind of thing.
Yeah.
If you were to sum up the 80s and tell me why you think it was an important decade for the entire 100 years of the NFL, what would you say?
Well, whenever it came to football, I thought nothing could have beaten the 90s when it came to football. But whenever I went back and watched the 80s, I saw that the brand of football they played was even more entertaining than it was in the 90s because there was just so many good defensive players back then. There was a level of defense that you don't see anymore, and but it wasn't so much. I mean, you still had the high scoring games. You still had there was such a good balance, and the good old saying, "Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it." And the NFL has to make sure they never go back to having these labor strikes and those problems that they had with, of course, the 1987 strike where they had the replacement players, and that was just a total disaster. But they rebounded from that, and they haven't had one since. But they have to make sure they never go through that again because of how much it hurt at the time.
Yeah, that's something that having that could take them back, decades if they were to have to shut down a season and potentially give the opportunity for one of these other leagues that want to become something a chance to kind of pounce on
Right.
it. But the way I see it right now, if they just keep things going, if they can keep the labor agreements together, they probably will remain the top dog for
Yeah.
quite some time. And you mentioned you thought the 90s was just the best football because that's when you grew up and you watched it and you wrote that first book.
Right.
But then now you're kind of looking at the 80s. Which of the two is your favorite decade now?
Well, whenever it comes to the results of the decade, I definitely pick the 90s because the Packers were really good. I liked how it turned out for my team in the 90s. But if I were to be honest, what was the best football I've ever seen? It would probably be the 80s, actually. And who knows? I'm starting to go back and watch some of the games of the 70s. Maybe I'll look back and say the 70s are the best when I'm finished looking at that decade. But yeah, I'd have to go with the 80s, slightly over the 90s.
So is that kind of a little teaser bomb into what your next project's going to be?
Yeah, I decided that I was way back whenever I started working on the 90s book, I decided I was going to make a trilogy. I was going to make 90s, 80s, and 70s in that order. And so I've gone through the first 2. Now, I know there's a lot of books out there on the 70s, probably more than any other decade, really. The 70s seem to have the most books, but mine is a little different. It's more of a play-by-play type of, you know, the little details, that kind of thing. And that's how mine is going to stand out once I get through with it, but it may take another 2 years. So, yeah. So that's kind of what I'm working on yet.
Well, in the meantime, we have the 90s and the 80s to listen to or to read.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's play a little fun game then. If you were to take the top 5 teams from the 90s and a playoff against the top 5 teams from the 80s, who do you think will come out on top?
Boy, that would be tough. Because I'm thinking about the Cowboys of the 90s and the 49ers of the 80s. I think the 90s, if the 90s had the Cowboys under Jimmy Johnson and not under Barry Switzer, and the 49ers who had Steve Young and were at the top of their game, probably the 90s teams would come out on top, but it would be pretty close.
Yeah, something that's one of those impossible to really
Yeah.
tell. I mean,
Yeah.
it'd be fun, but the only way we could maybe tell is take some of those players back in time, which is a question I always ask. I'm going to give you the virtual keys to my DeLorean. You can go back to any point in NFL history. It can be part of the 80s if you wish. What moment are you going to go to? You can't change the outcome, though.
Okay. Boy, I'd have to go back to the 1985 Bears. Yeah, even though as a Packers fan, I'm not a fan of the Bears at all, but that team was just one of the most outrageous and amazing teams. One of the teams that got so much focus off the field, almost more than they did on the field. And that team kind of changed football because then after that, you had all these other teams trying to do their own Super Bowl shuffle. And because I remember the Steelers doing something like that back when I first got into football in 1995. And it all came from that Super Bowl shuffle. You had Jim McMahon wearing the headbands of all these different causes and companies, all these things. And of course, you had the refrigerator, William Perry, running the ball. He even threw a pass in the Super Bowl. Just that team was just so crazy, and you just have to wonder they lost that one game in Miami, and if they could have won that, would they have gone 19-0? Or the other way of thinking about it, if Miami didn't lose to New England in the AFC Championship game, maybe Miami beats Chicago in the Super Bowl. So you never know.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that their only game lost was to the only team that had been undefeated in the modern era there.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, I mean, we're going to put links to your books in the show notes. Are there any parting words of wisdom you want to give to the listeners of the show?
I just suggest that you go back and watch old games and read about old games, read about old decades, because the NFL has kind of forgotten about its history. They had the big NFL 100 thing, but the only players people were talking about were players from the 21st century. They kind of forgot about and they certainly forgot about anything before the Super Bowl era, and that's kind of sad because there were so many great teams back in the 50s and 60s, and so if I were to suggest anything, I just say go and read up on history, even watch old games online, and immerse yourself in the history of the NFL.
There you go. His suggestion: immerse yourself in the history of the NFL. I wonder how you can do that, or where you could come up with some content to be able to immerse yourself in various ways of the history of the NFL. I'll leave that one to you. But I also do want to give a big thank you to Tommy for riding shotgun in this DeLorean and sharing an overview of football in the 80s. We talked a little bit about the 90s, but mostly focused on his newest book, Great 80s, A Journey Through Another Exciting Decade in Pro Football History. And again, to learn more about Tommy and all of his books, head over to thefootballhistorydude.com, which takes you to my page on the Sports History Network. Also, if you're interested in joining our network, there's many ways you can do so. You can make Sports History Network your home field advantage for your own personal blog. You can start your own podcast. You can even just become affiliated with the network so then you can help promote your show through all of our channels. If you want to do so, visit the contact page on the site. That's, of course, sportshistorynetwork.com/contact. But for now, dudes, I'm through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football History Dude. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice and head on over to thefootballhistorydude.com for the show notes and more information on the history of the NFL. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.